Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses. I also want to thank the staff for the excellent work that they did together to prepare us for this. Dr. Casey, I wanted to ask you about distributed generation, and maybe you could describe for me what are the challenges in terms of reliability to the proliferation of distributed generation, and whether the state is looking at weighing in terms of what's the most efficient way to provide, say, solar power. Is it large-scale solar farms, or is it rooftop? Is the state taking a position on that and moving it one way or another, or are we just kind of letting that happen?
Okay. Well, with respect to reliability issues with distributed energy, I think it deals mainly with modernizing the distribution network to accommodate it. As you know, these systems were designed with one-way flow of power from large central stations to consumers that were kind of static consumers. The grid of the future is going to be much more dynamic. You're going to have bidirectional flows. You're going to have a lot of automation on the system. So I think from a reliability standpoint, the distribution utilities are really struggling to keep pace with how they need to upgrade the distribution network to provide the safety and controls to make sure that that dynamic can be reliably managed. I think from a transmission, as a transmission grid operator, that's really not our issue. That's the issue for the distribution utility. But as I mentioned, we are trying to leverage those distribution networks as a resource for the transmission network. On your question around going forward, is California going to rely more on large central station renewables versus distribution? My sense, it's going to be both. I think what's happening on the distribution system is it's not policy-driven, it's consumer-driven. People want more control. I know you're very involved with the naval bases in San Diego. They want more resiliency with their system, with their microgrids. Other companies are doing the same. So a lot of that's just happening, and we're enabling it. But to achieve ultimately the environmental policy objectives California has, you're going to need more large central station solar and wind.
Right. I would just ask the panel a question on cybersecurity, and maybe ask it in a overly provocative ways. Why should I trust you to take care of cybersecurity? Is there a federal role for that? What interests you in having federal participation? What scares you about that? Does anyone want to offer me some advice about why I should get involved or why I should sit back?
Ms. Peters, I'm happy to address that. This is a joint effort. We are the people on the front lines. It's our systems that people are trying to hack into in many cases. But what the federal government has is the authority through this Congress to require standards. That's very important. Also, the federal government has information as to threats that we don't have. We're not an intelligence agency. So I think this is not an either-or proposition. It is really a partnership.
Okay. Anybody else? I think that makes sense to me. I think the information, best practices, setting standards makes a lot of sense. And I know we've taken some steps in the last decade to make sure that an outage in one place doesn't so gravely affect the whole country. So I think there's some protection. But if you have any thoughts after this on that, I'd love to hear it. Finally, Mr. Jones, I am not as familiar with the regulatory regime in New York. I assume that that's what's driving investment in renewables and the reduction in emissions that you described. Can you just tell me a little bit about whether that's the case and what it is about the regulatory framework in New York that's helping?
So the regulatory framework, coupling with the efficiencies that are driven out of the markets within our systems itself, is what's really contributed to those reductions. So more efficient generation has come to our markets to compete. That more efficient generation has lower emissions than the less efficient generation. So, and as the new generation comes to market, much of the older generation has left that had higher heat rates and higher emissions. So it's been a combination of both. On top of that, the state of New York has been a driver for decades in trying to improve the environment throughout New York and throughout the country for that matter. There's a number of initiatives in place, as I had mentioned earlier, achieving a high renewables penetration, achieving significant reductions in carbon emissions that are driving changes in our markets as we attempt to achieve that through the NYSO itself.
Thank you very much again to the witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.